Next, Cole Fischer will be presenting also on cobalt, something related to that area, the mineralogical and hydrogeochemical characterization of mine wastes near Cobalt, Ontario. So, Cole, take it away.
Awesome, thanks. Yeah, thanks, Melissa, for that presentation too. It's like our interests, I think, have aligned pretty strongly, but we there are like some pretty key differences that I think we can maybe chat after this because I think our study will kind of like mesh well together. Okay, so let me share my screen here. Okay, awesome. All right, so similar to Melissa, my study site was in Cobalt, Ontario. So this is on Cart Lake, which was the only lake that I sampled as a part of my research. It's a picture of an old mill that's right in the upper reaches of Cart Lake. So that's me on the left, and then my supervisors, Dr. Tom Al and Dr. Danielle Fortin, both professors with University of Ottawa in Earth Sciences. Danielle's specialty is kind of biogeochemistry, and Tom's is kind of like the interface between aqueous chemistry and like mineralogical work. So between both their expertise, they had a lot to add to this project. So I'm very grateful for their help so far. So I'll kind of skip a lot of the introduction of Cobalt just to save some time since Melissa already covered that. But yeah, Cobalt's about 5 hours northwest of Ottawa, and Cart Lake is about 1.6 kilometers south of Cobalt. So this is an aerial photo of Cart Lake. It used to be just kind of like a normal lake, but that mill at the top of the tailings there filled in the entire lake with tailings. So it's pretty heavily impacted by mining residues. It was the site of the Silverfields Mill, which operated from 1960 to 1980, and it's representative of the second generation of milling processes, which was mostly flotation separation. So there's a little bit less cyanide and mercury than other tailings in the area, which kind of helped us really focus down on just arsenic geochemistry and sort of tailor our study to one element at a time, which is sort of nice. The tailings are pretty coarse grained, and there's a thickness ranging between 30 centimeters and 3 meters in the deepest part of the lake, so pretty variable thickness, and lots of different lenses of pipe tailings that are sort of geographically dispersed throughout the tailings. So lots of spatial variation in the site. There's been a lot of research done in Cart Lake and the Cobalt area in particular. So the main one is Charles Dumaresque, who is sort of the authority of all things cobalt. He did a huge master's project probably a decade and a bit ago, and that was like kind of the first foray into characterizing all these tailings and what has been going on there. There's been lots of mineralogical work done in Cart Lake, lots of hydrogeochemical work, and then a few kind of social and historical studies carried out as well. It has lots to offer for a few different disciplines. There's also a private sector consulting firm which works for Agnico Eagle, which is sort of one of the main bodies involved with the remediation of the Cobalt area tailings. So our primary objectives were to characterize the geochemical composition of the tailings pore water. So we did a bit of water work, which is kind of nice, and then characterize the reactive minerals and the alteration products that are associated with them in the tailings, and then sort of provided an interpretation of what's going on between the solid and liquid phase in these tailings, which has implications for the mobility of transport of solutes, particularly arsenic in this system. So Charles had left a few piezometers still installed in the site. So we did an assessment of all the remaining piezometers, and 5 of them were still in pretty good sampling condition. So we took samples from those 5 piezometers just using syringes. So no fancy groundwater sampling gear, but we also extracted a series of vertical tailings cores and then dug a test pit to about 1 meter depth in the tailings and extracted some horizontal cores just for higher spatial resolution in the area above the water table. So I'll explain a bit more about the cores a bit later, but we also collected some surface crust that we observed just kind of in and around the standing water on site. So this is our setup for analysis of our water samples in the field. So most of you will be familiar with like a digital titrator on the left there, and then ORP and pH meters. So we, as soon as the samples were out of the ground, we tried to get them analyzed for these 3 parameters as soon as possible, just to avoid kind of these changes in these key geochemical parameters and transport back to the lab. So for the groundwater samples, for anions, we used ion chromatography, and then for cations, we used ICP-MS and ICP-OES for the minors and majors, respectively. And this is just sort of a list of all the analytes that we look for. So kind of the standard run of geochemical analytes. So the standard majors and the standard minors, and then the kind of the anions were just sort of the full suite of analytes that we ran through. So the vertical cores, we extracted 3 of them side by side to a depth of about 2.6 meters, right in the middle of the tailings. And we used one of those cores and all of these horizontal core sections, which are only about a foot deep and just inserted manually into the side of the tailings pit. We extracted pore water from those using centrifugation and then just like a filtration and immediate analysis of field parameters, so like the alkalinity, pH, and redox potential. And then analyze the extracted water from the vertical and horizontal cores using the same methods that we use for the groundwater samples. So for mineralogy, what we've done so far is X-ray diffraction analysis of the surface crust. So this background picture here is a picture of one of the crusts, and we found them to be mostly kind of gypsum-centered with not a lot of the typical cobalt contaminants in them. So it wasn't as interesting as we were kind of hoping for, but for the mineralogy work, we anaerobically dehydrated the vertical cores cut in half using a closed circuit loop of nitrogen gas with desiccant crystals. So we're just circulating pure nitrogen gas through and then changing out the desiccant crystals every time they switched from blue to pink. So the idea of that was just kind of reduce the weathering rates of those primary minerals in the tailings through elimination of exposure to oxygen as much as we possibly could. We prepared thin sections just by impregnating the cores at certain areas that showed sort of interesting coloration or where we suspected there was going to be kind of a higher concentration of these reactive ore minerals. Just impregnation with resin and then cutting down and polishing to these sort of standard sized thin sections on which we use a scanning electron microscope under electron dispersion spectroscopy and then electron microprobe analysis. So to get into the results, this is a chart showing all the range and concentrations of our groundwater samples. So as you can see, kind of as expected, the principal cations are calcium, which is to be expected in an area with such a high concentration of carbonate minerals. And that kind of lines up with the primary anions as well. So alkalinity made up the highest, mostly in bicarbonate form, followed by sulfate, which is also to be expected where you have these kind of sulfidic ore minerals that have been processed years and years ago, but are still kind of kicking around in these tailings. So as I mentioned earlier, arsenic had one of the highest variabilities in terms of a geographic distribution on site, which shows that as they were piping the tailings into the lake, their milling processes weren't consistent enough to achieve a totally homogeneous distribution of these constituents in those tailings. So there's areas with a lot higher concentrations of ore minerals, as shown in the arsenic concentrations, and during weathering processes, so as water is kind of infiltrating down, it sort of concentrates some of these contaminants into lenses above layers that are slightly more impermeable. So this is a profile of those main 3 field parameters that we extracted from the vertical and horizontal cores. So the black lines represent the vertical cores, so to a depth of about 2.5 meters, and then the gray lines represent the higher resolution pore water extracted from the horizontal cores in the tailings pit. So the pH was pretty close to neutral, but on the basic side, so between 8 and 8.5, kind of decreasing a bit after you get below the water table, which is represented by these blue lines. Alkalinity expressed as bicarbonate showed kind of the strongest trend with depth in that decreased pretty sharply below the water table and was highest right at the surface. So the major cations showed a pretty good agreement between the horizontal cores and the vertical cores. You could see the high resolution lines aligned fairly well for the most part with the vertical lines. Calcium, the alignment is obviously the strongest because the concentrations are highest. So there's a larger, it's easier to get agreement when your concentrations are a bit higher. So the minor cations also show fairly good agreement. but a bit more dispersed than the majors just because we're working with much smaller concentrations. So the range of analytical accuracy kind of contributed to a bit noisier data here. But in the case of magnesium and strontium, they lined up pretty well. So this is the last kind of black and white chart. I'm sorry if it's a lot of data to present at once, but if I can draw your attention just to the arsenic vertical pore water profile. That was kind of why I was curious that Melissa found such high rates of arsenic in the sediments, because the range of arsenic in the tailings was a lot lower, so ranging from 0 to about 20 parts per million, which makes sense because most of the arsenic that we're looking at here is obviously in the aqueous phase, whereas she was actually dissolving sediments. So yeah, it's interesting. There's such a high disparity between dissolved sediments and the arsenic that's actually in the groundwater on site. So anions showed kind of similar trends. So alkalinity was highest in the early reaches of the tailings, the upper reaches. And then it kind of increased, the degree of sulfate dominance increases around below the water table. Interestingly, nitrate was extremely high right at the top, and that's due to some revegetation efforts that occurred on Pine Lake. So it was a university group, not under the direction of any particular project, but they incorporated a bunch of fertilizer and then tried to grow some plants on the tailings to see if they could just kind of keep the wind-blown dust down, with mixed to not very high degrees of success. But that was one of the other studies that is not very well documented that was carried out at Cart Lake. So onto the mineralogy results. We identified several primary reactive minerals, like pyrite, arsenopyrite, 2 different solid solutions, so scutterudite solid solutions, and a safflorite, lullingite, and Ramelsbergite solution. And also some pretty clearly identified langazite. There's a gamut of secondary minerals, a lot of mixed compositions, calcium, ferric arsenates, which I'll get into in the next couple of diagrams. So this is a scanning electron microscopy image showing a safflorite lullingite solution at the bottom here, and then a mixed composition calcium iron arsenate, which showed compositions close to arsenosiderite, but not we weren't able to really conclusively identify a lot of these calcium iron arsenates just because the composition is so varied between primary minerals that it challenged us that way. On the top right, there was a lot of erythrite in these tailings as well, which is remarkable from its bright pink coloration. So from a mass balance perspective, the erythrite we think must have been transported here because it has such high percentage compositions of cobalt, whereas a lot of these primary minerals, in terms of atomic percentages, have pretty low cobalt concentrations. So we think a lot of the erythrite is not the direct result of alteration of a primary mineral, but rather transport of its components and then precipitation in place between these reactive mineral grains. So this is another scanning electron microscopy image of a pretty pure safflorite grain and another mixed composition arsenate, which in this case is closest to ceruddite. But still, we weren't able to really conclusively identify it. So this is a slide showing our transmission electron microscopy results, but kind of superimposed on the scanning electron microscopy image, just because the image is a lot clearer. So these are point analyses of the secondary calcium iron arsenate minerals. And chart B here shows those point analyses compared to the relative oxide weight percentages of the 3 calcium iron arsenates and erythrite that we were expecting in the tailings. So as you can see, these point analyses don't line up super well with the expected composition for those secondary minerals, which I was hoping they would line up a little bit better, but it kind of just shows that they are mixed and they can't really be classified without a lot more detailed mineralogical work into these categories of arsenosiderite, euconite, and ceruddite. And these analytical maps at the bottom are in atomic percentage, so they kind of just reaffirm that yes, this grain is arsenopyrite. That's what those show. So this we also took some analytical transects using microprobe analysis. So you can see L1 at the top here is line 1, and that corresponds to this graph here. So you can see arsenic by weight percent is very high right at the beginning inside that primary mineral grain. Kind of drops and then remains sort of high for the interface. So in those weathering zones where the primary mineral is being transformed into calcium iron arsenates. And then towards the end, the arsenic really starts to drop off. So what that sort of indicates to us is that the arsenic from those primary mineral grains is being weathered and loosely held in place by these secondary mineral assemblages and then released into solution as the sort of the terminal zones of that weathering progresses towards the mineral grain.
Cole, I hate to jump in, but we're past 15 minutes, so if you
okay, sorry. All right. So our future work, we're going to put all these concentrations into frequency and discuss what's keeping the arsenic in or out of solution, and then discuss how that has implications for the mobility and fate of the contaminants that we find in Cart Lake. Yeah, sorry for going over time there. I kind of knew I was going long, but that's it. Any questions?
Okay, thanks, Cole. No worries. Maybe just to keep things on track, we'll just wait. Any questions we'll do at the end for the discussion section.